For over 80 years, Steinway's two factories couldn't agree on their own piano. New York built one version, Hamburg built another. Same name on the fall board, two genuinely different instruments. And in 2006, one of them lost. I'm going to play you both, and you can describe for yourself whether Steinway made the right call. Welcome to Living Pianos. Robert Estrin here, and today we're talking about one of the strangest stories in Steinway's history, the Model L and the Model O, two nearly identical around 5-foot 10-inch grand pianos, built by the same company that quietly diverged for the better part of a century. Now, most piano owners have never heard this story, but if you understand it, you understand something important about how even the most respected piano maker in the world makes decisions, and sometimes gets them wrong before correcting course. Here's the basic shape of the story. Steinway has operated two factories for well over a century, one in New York, one in Hamburg, Germany. Both factories build grand pianos under the same name to broadly the same design philosophy. But they aren't identical operations. They use different actions until quite recently, different preparation techniques, and in some cases, different specifications entirely for what are ostensibly the same model. The Model O is Steinway's original 5-foot 10-inch grand, and it's an elegant, well-proportioned instrument, a size that works beautifully in most homes and doesn't have room for a concert grand, but if you want genuine Steinway quality and tone. But in 1923, Steinway introduced something new, the Model L. The same basic footprint, same intended market, but a redesigned instrument with a broader tail. The engineering rationale was straightforward. A broader tail typically allows for a longer string length, larger soundboard area within the same overall footprint, which can translate into a fuller, more resonant tone. So New York adapted the Model L and built it almost exclusively for the next 80+ years. Now, meanwhile, Hamburg did something different. Hamburg kept building the Model O. I want you to hear the actual difference, or in some cases, the actual similarity, because these two instruments, are very, very similar. Here's what I want you to notice. The Model L's broader tail does tend to produce a certain fullness in the lower mid-range. You could probably hear it in the sustain as well. Whereas the Model O has its own character. Some players and technicians have described it as slightly more focused, slightly more precise in articulation, depending on the individual instrument's regulation, voicing, and other preparation. Because neither of these is a dramatic night and day difference. And that's actually the most important part of this story. Because if the difference were obvious and clearly decisive, this wouldn't have taken 80 years to resolve. Here's the part of this story that I find genuinely fascinating, and it's the part most piano owners never think to ask about. Steinway is one company. It has one engineering philosophy, one brand standard, and one reputation to protect. And yet, for over 80 years, its two factories quietly gave two different answers to the exact same design question. What's the ideal 5-foot 10-inch grand piano? That's not a minor footnote. That's teams of expert piano builders operating under the same company name, disagreeing in practice, if not on paper, about their own instrument for the better part of a century. New York bet on the Model L's redesign. Hamburg didn't take the bet. Both continued building their version, selling successfully for decades. This tells you something important. Even a company with Steinway's engineering pedigree doesn't have a single, obvious, universally agreed upon answer to what makes a piano correct. Design decisions in piano manufacturing are judgment calls informed by engineering. but shaped by regional preference, market feedback, and institutional inertia, Steinway New York and Steinway Hamburg made different judgment calls, and they let the market in time decide who was right. Here's what almost nobody talks about, and it's the part of the story that actually explains the 2006 decision. Building a grand piano requires enormous tooling investment. The rim, the curved wooden case that gives a grand piano its shape, It requires specific press and mold for each model. The plate, the cast iron frame under tension, requires its own casting pattern. The axle requires its own jig and specification set. All of this is model specific. Running the Model L in New York and the Model O in Hamburg for over 80 years meant Steinway was maintaining 2 full sets of specialized tooling, 2 rim presses, 2 casting patterns, 2 action specifications, for what is fundamentally the same market position. 2 nearly identical answers to the same question, each with its own dedicated infrastructure. This isn't a trivial cost. Tooling, maintenance, specialized labor training, parts inventory, all of it duplicated indefinitely for a product line that occupies the same competitive space in the market. From a pure operations standpoint, this is the kind of redundancy that a company eventually has to examine. And in 2006, Steinway did examine it. New York stopped building the Model L. Production standardized on the Model O. Hamburg's design across both factories. Now, before I get into what that 2006 decision actually tells us and what it means if you're considering either of these instruments today, make sure you subscribe here to Living Pianos, because we have videos like this every week covering the parts of piano history and the piano industry that most sources never clearly explain. Now, here's a question worth sitting with after 80 years of running 2 parallel designs. Why did New York's Model L lose? I want to be careful here because I don't think the honest reading of this is the Model L was a bad piano. It wasn't. Plenty of extraordinary performances have happened on Model Ls, and plenty of pianist technicians and have genuine affection for that instrument-specific character. The bigger soundboard, the longer strings, the overall fatter sound. But when Steinway made the decision to standardize the Model O across both factories, that was a real verdict made by the company itself with full internal knowledge of both instruments' performance in the market, their cost structures, their long-term viability. Now, companies don't make decisions like this lightly, and they don't make them based on nostalgia. They make them based on decades of data about which instruments sold better, served the market more effectively, and justified its dedicated tooling investment going forward. So in a very real sense, yes, New York's 80-year-old bet on the Model L was eventually not the direction the company chose to continue. Hamburg's Model O is now the standard around 5-foot 10-inch grand across the entire Steinway operation. Both factories. That is Steinway telling you through action rather than marketing language which design it believes in the long term. So here's the practical question. If you're in the market for a Steinway in this size range today, what do you actually need to know? First, new production Model Ls no longer exist. If you want a new Steinway in this size category, you're getting the Model O. That's simply the current product line. Second, if you're looking at a used piano, you may well encounter a vintage L that you like. These instruments were built for over 80 years in New York in significant numbers, and many of them are excellent pianos in their own right. In fact, many people prefer the robust tone of the Model L with its larger soundboard. In fact, a well-maintained, properly regulated vintage Model L is not only not an inferior instrument just because the company eventually discontinued the model, it's simply an instrument with a design lineage that what's currently available is different. Third, and this is the most important point, the individual instrument matters more than the model designation in either direction, because a more poorly maintained Model O and a beautifully maintained vintage Model L are not comparable simply by looking at which letter is stamped on the plate. Have any used in this size range L or O evaluated by an independent technician before you buy. Ask about the soundboard condition, the pin block, the action, regulation history. Those factors are going to tell you way more about the actual instrument in front of you than 80 years of corporate design history. What this story actually teaches you goes beyond just these two pianos. Even the most respected instrument makers in the world aren't operating for perfection or unified certainty. You know, these are living, breathing instruments. They run experiments sometimes for 80 years before they get a clear enough signal to make a decision. Institutional confidence, brand reputation, and internal disagreement can coexist inside the same company for far longer than most buyers assume. That should change how you evaluate any instrument from any manufacturer. The name on the floorboard tells you the company's reputation, sometimes assuming that it's the same company from generations ago. But it doesn't tell you the internal history of the specific model in front of you. How long it was built, whether it was the company's preferred design or its legacy design, or how confidently the company itself would stand behind it today. Understanding that history, the way we just did with the Model L and the Model O, makes you a fundamentally more informed buyer. However, there's another fundamental change of Steinway corporate policy that plays a part in this decision to unify the Model O across both factories. Steinway has strived to unify nearly all the pianos in its two factories. The Model A, which was only made in Hamburg for most of the 20th century, is now made in New York as well. Thank goodness. Only Hamburg Steinways had Renner actions until recently. But Steinway bought Renner and closed the action production facility in its New York factory. So all Steinways have Renner actions now. But sadly, that means their coveted accelerated action is no longer made because it was only available in New York. Another interesting fact is that only the Model C is made in Hamburg and not New York, which is a story for another video. A spectacular scale design, bigger than the Model B and smaller than the Model D concert grand. By the way, if you found this kind of information and history available to you interesting, the real stories behind the models, not just the marketing hype, subscribe right here. This is exactly what Living Pianos is built around, and we publish new videos like this every week. And I want to hear from you directly. If you've played both Model L and Model O, which one did you prefer and why? Did you hear the difference I described, or did it sound closer than you expected? Leave it in the comments here at livingpianos.com or on YouTube. I read as many as I can, and I'd like to hear from you about this. I'm Robert Estrin. Thanks for watching, and keep playing. This is Living Pianos, your online piano store.